those factors in place, one shouldn't be surprised when you have low economic growth, low economic activity, and less job creation. And then you look at both internal and external factors. And if you possibly open yourself up to worse external factors through your own foreign policy, domestic policy, political choices, political decisions around the economy, you open yourself up then to those risks being even more exacerbated and being made even worse. So we're in a weak position. And if we're exposed to something like secondary sanctions, maybe being cut off from the SWIFT international system of payments, then you look at even worse consequences for the economy.
And Chris, when we talk about the economy, one of the indicators that most people will look at, which we're going to have for everyone in a moment here on the show, is the US dollar, because this is where it puts us in this sort of stepchild situation. The US, the UK, very much our biggest trading partner. But then, of course, we're in this involvement in BRICS, where China and Russia is coming in. I want everyone to take a look at the numbers very, very quickly. Here they are this morning. And I want you to see very carefully what's happening with the dollar. It's 1977. It's actually gotten worse from 1968 at the close yesterday. But that's not even half the story, Chris. It was above 1977 yesterday. Does this indicate to us, we'll talk about Russia in a moment, does this indicate something like a stagflation? I hope I've said that correctly, the risk of stagflation. And there's also concerns around a technical recession. Then we bring in grey listing, and now we're bringing in sanctions. It's a painful conversation to have right now.
No, 100%. The point on stagflation, that scenario when you have rising or perennially high inflation, but your reserve bank or your central bank continues to hike rates. It tries to get a handle on that inflation, and you just don't have real economic growth. And I think maybe we're seeing that at the moment in the South African context. And one of the main reasons for that could be because our manufacturing base has declined so much over the last few years. We're much more exposed to imported inflation and supply side shocks. So it's one thing for the Reserve Bank to keep hiking rates. I think the Reserve Bank is trying its best with a very blunt tool, one of the only main tools that it has to get a handle on inflation. But because we're in an integrated global economy, because we're more exposed to imported inflation, and because we've got these local drivers of higher inflation, things like load shedding, transport costs, rising food and fuel prices, that in turn means you can only do so much with monetary policy. If you don't fix some of those local supply side issues, you're not really going to see lowering inflation. And then in that global context of the dollar, for example, BRICS, I think there can be arguments to be made for looking at different currencies, different trading partners, all that sort of thing. But in the long run, I think the South African government is doing damage to its own sort of stability, credibility, transparency with its various moves on foreign policy issues. So regardless of who you trade with, you want to be presented, number one, have this image of, but also in action, be stable, be transparent, have predictable policy, predictable actions, regardless of who your trading partners happen to be.
Because now we're going to have the situation a little later in the year. The Russian president, Vladimir Putin, is expected to come to South Africa as part of BRICS as well. The United States have been reacting to that. We've even seen our own domestic political parties, namely one of them being the Democratic Alliance. They'd like to see him arrested. Then we have how government needs to handle this. Then we're hearing words like immunity, international immunity and diplomatic immunity being thrown around as well. So I don't foresee, and tell me if you agree or disagree, Chris, that it's going to get much better in the build-up to BRICS, which, if I remember correctly, is coming up in August as well. So the risk of sanctions, knowing that the president of Russia could be coming to the country, we need to take that very seriously, don't we?
No, 100%. And if you look at South Africa's position of neutrality or non-alignment on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I think it's one thing for a country to say that it is non-aligned, but then you need to practice active non-alignment. For example, don't engage in military drills with the aggressor country, as one example. Send diplomatic missions, engage with both sides, as President Ramaphosa has been doing in the last 2 weeks. So maybe we're seeing a slight change in the country's practicing of its non-alignment, so that could help lower the risk of secondary sanctions. But I think in the long run, with an election next year as well, perhaps domestically, government wants to be seen, needs to be seen to be doing something in various spheres. And here we could see a step up in how it's trying to practice its non-alignment.
Chris Hattingh, I appreciate your time in coming on to make sense of everything for us, what's happening as far as this non-alignment, this neutrality, I think was the word that Chris used as well, of South Africa, even though South Africa are trying to play in the middle, not upset either the West or what is happening over in Russia with that Russia-Ukraine conflict. It certainly is having an effect. And when that Reserve Bank comes out and starts saying things that we could end up in sanctions, for example, with sanctions against South Africa, it's very, very worrying.